Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I'm president of the City Club's Board of Directors. Each year the City Club is pleased to present the High School Debate Championships. The Debate Championships, along with our high school student program and youth forum series, are part of the City Club's commitment to ensure that we reach students as we pursue our mission of informing, educating, and inspiring citizens by presenting significant ideas and providing opportunities for dialogue in a collegial setting, which is what we have here today. We are proud of the talented young people who participate in City Club programs and are pleased that today's championships will be telecast and broadcast so that viewers in greater Cleveland and listeners across the country are able to hear the students intelligently argue their positions. We are also very pleased to have the continuing support of the law firm Baker & Hostetler for this program, and I will now turn the program over to John Parker, a partner with the law firm. John?
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce the 2011 High School Debate Championship to you. As I was walking over today, I thought, what a great week to be in Cleveland, Ohio. On Tuesday night at the Wolstein Center, the Cleveland State basketball team had the first round of the NIT Tournament Championship, and they'll be playing again on Saturday. Yesterday, we had over 100,000 people lining Superior Avenue for the St. Patrick's Day Parade. Later today, at the Quicken Loans Arena, Ohio State kicks off their first round game in the NCAA tournament. But for me, a former high school debater, the ultimate event is being held at the City Club today. And that, of course, is the 2011 High School Debate Championship, sponsored by Baker & Hostetler in memory of our late partner, Pat Jordan. Pat was an accomplished high school debater. He was an outstanding trial lawyer and a dear friend. Normally, in the last couple of years, we've been privileged to have his daughter, Ann, come up after me and explain the rules of the debate to us. But Ann this morning left for a service trip to Honduras, so she can't be with us. And that's a wonderful legacy to her father and certainly a great reflection on her mother, Sharon, and the rest of her family. So we wish her well on that trip. So, without further ado, in her place, we're going to have her debate coach from, or the head of the debate program at Laurel School, where Ann attends, to explain the rules. So, good luck to both of the debaters, and Rich Qualter.
Thank you, John. First of all, on behalf of the Cleveland District of the Ohio High School Speech League and the North Coast District of the National Forensic League and the many hundreds of students who participate in speech and debate in Northeast Ohio, I'd like to express our sincere thanks to the City Club for providing this fabulous forum for high school debate. I'd also like to express our deep gratitude to the law firm of Baker & Hostetler for the unwavering support of interscholastic debate in memory and honor of their partner, Pat Jordan. For the past 3 years, as John mentioned, this introduction has been given by Pat's daughter, Ann Jordan, and as John also mentioned, she is on her way right now to Honduras, where she's going to be working for spring break at a school and orphanage for the children there in Honduras. During Ann's high school career, I've had the privilege of being both her teacher and her coach. And I can tell you that today, as she's ready to graduate from high school, she's every bit as passionate about high school speech and debate as her father was. And I can also tell you with certainty, as her high school teacher and coach, that her father would be very, very proud of her. So about today's event. This is a contest in Lincoln-Douglas debate, which requires our competitors to consider a proposition of value. And for today's debate, that proposition of value will be resolved. The United States is justified in using private military firms abroad to pursue its military objectives. Each debater, the affirmative and the negative, will try to convince the judges that their side of the resolution better upholds some value that society holds dear, for example, justice or security. The affirmative debater will first present a constructive case and will then be cross-examined by the negative. We then switch as the negative presents a constructive case and also begins the rebuttal of the affirmative, followed by an affirmative cross-examination. We'll then have a series of rebuttals before the debate is finally placed in the hands of our three judges. And those three judges are, first of all, we're lucky to have the two coaches of two of the fastest growing speech and debate programs here in Northeast Ohio, Mr. Jeff Womack of Chagrin Falls High School and Mr. Ryan Peoples of Berea High School. And also, we are very fortunate to have one of the most respected debate judges in the Cleveland area, Mr. George Yaniga, who is operations manager for UPS and has been a community volunteer debate judge every Saturday without fail for at least the past 10 years. Our timekeeper today will be Ms. Abby Davis of Magnificat High School. And last, but certainly not least, our two debaters. First of all, debating on the affirmative, Mr. Evan Meisler of University School. And debating on the negative, Ms. Gurbani Kaur of Hathaway Brown School. So, debaters, if you're both ready, I wish you both the best of luck and invite you to begin.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank the City Club for promoting the freedom of speech and giving me and my opponent the chance to be here today. I would also like to thank my coaches, Mr. Paik, Mr. Lewis, and Ms. Dinsmore, as well as my team and my parents for all their support. I affirm the resolution. Resolved, the United States is justified in using private military firms abroad to pursue its military objectives. To clarify the round, I define to justify as to give or be a good reason for. The value for the round is societal welfare. Societal welfare is the proper value for this round for two reasons. First, the use of the word justified in the resolution asks us to provide a good reason to use or not use private military firms. The effect that they might have on the welfare of society is a sufficient warrant. Second, the resolution concerns the government and the military, both of which exist to promote the welfare of the United States and its citizens. In the 21st century, our military objectives are becoming increasingly focused on combating terrorism and other threats to global security and human rights. Should the U.S. military fail to act as a global force for the advancement of human rights, democracy, and security, the welfare of our own society and others around the world would be seriously jeopardized. Although military force should be applied judiciously, the fact remains that when the military is employed, it must be employed effectively, as otherwise there is no benefit to society. For these reasons, the value criterion for the round is military effectiveness. Before presenting my contentions for this round, I would like to offer a brief observation. The use of the word justified in the resolution restricts this debate to a judgment of whether the United States, on balance and as a general principle, would benefit more by using or not using private military firms. Therefore, the side that demonstrates that its position in general contributes more to societal welfare should win the round. My first contention is that the United States military could not function without private military firms. This is true for three reasons. First, private military firms are necessary to supplement available manpower in the United States military. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has considerably decreased the size of its military. However, the United States today finds itself faced with even more pressing global military obligations than before. In a report to Congress on the size of our military, National Defense Specialist Edward Bruner wrote, quote, "From 1989 to 1999, end strength dropped steadily from 2.1 million to 1.4 million. Expectations that military requirements would diminish, however, were not realized. U.S. forces deployed to new missions in such places as the Persian Gulf, Haiti, the Balkans, Somalia, and with the recent advent of the global war on terror, Afghanistan and other far-flung places." End quote. The 35% reduction in the size of our military means that our forces are stretched too thin to accomplish their objectives on their own. For example, without the use of private military firms, U.S. manpower in Afghanistan would amount to less than half of what it is today. If for nothing else, private military firms are fundamentally necessary to augment the sheer volume of our armed forces. Second, with the logistical requirements of modern warfare, private military contractors serve special roles to which our regular military is not well suited. According to a report published by the Center for a New American Security, as of June 2009, only 11% of the contractors in Iraq were there for security purposes. The other 89% were involved in construction, communication, transportation, and other crucial but non-combat related tasks that the military doesn't have the manpower to perform. The same report states, quote, long-term nation-building efforts like those in Iraq and Afghanistan require an array of functions, from advising and training foreign security forces to constructing and maintaining power plants and waterworks, that the U.S. government is not manned to carry out on its own, end quote. Third, unlike regular military personnel, private military agents are trained for the specific role of utilizing intelligence and surveillance technology. This role has become increasingly important in the context of the global war on terror. In his article in the Connecticut Law Review, Scott Sullivan writes, quote, contractors engaged in intelligence gathering combine technological expertise and analytical skills with proven effectiveness. The bureaucratic strictures of the public sector do not allow the government the flexibility to identify, hire, or deploy these different skill sets as they might be needed, end quote. Without the special logistics and intelligence services provided exclusively by private military firms, our military would be critically impaired in pursuing its military objectives abroad. My second contention is that private military firms are good at what they do. This is true for two reasons. First, the demands of both the private sector and legislation force private firms to act accountably. As civilians operating in the private sector, private military firms depend on being able to land a contract with the Department of Defense. Therefore, it only makes financial sense for them to act in ways consistent with our government's missions and regulations. But even on the rare occasions when they fail to meet the guidelines set forth by our government, there are now mechanisms in place to hold them accountable. Mark Cansian of the U.S. Army War College writes, quote, Congress amended the Uniform Code of Military Justice to clearly cover civilians in support of military operations. Legal action against civilians can now be taken by the Department of Defense under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The first court-martial occurred in June of 2008, end quote. Both the pressures of business and the threat of legal action lead private military firms to act accountably. Second, private military agents enhance the professionalism of our armed forces. Private military agents are typically selected from ex-soldiers with years of experience. Robert D. Kaplan, a correspondent for The Atlantic, writes, quote, rather than mercenaries who will fight for the highest bidder, private contractors like KBR and Blackwater are composed mainly of retired American NCOs, working alongside the same military to which they used to belong. Just as other professions tap the wisdom and expertise of retirees, so does the American military, end quote. As an alternative to active combat service in the Army, private military firms offer retiring soldiers the opportunity to continue serving their country and allow the United States to retain its most experienced soldiers. For all of these reasons, private military firms enhance our military's effectiveness and therefore achieve the value of societal welfare. For all of these reasons, I strongly urge you to affirm and now stand open for cross-examination. Thank you.
Yeah.
Everyone ready? Let's start with the value of societal welfare. When we look to societal welfare, what society are we looking at in today's resolution?
Well, the resolution focuses on whether or not the U.S. is justified in using these private firms, so we're talking about the welfare of the United States.
Okay, so only the welfare of the United States then.
I mean, I'm not saying that, like, every other country in the world should be ignored, but at the very least, our government has the principal obligation to focus on its own citizens.
Okay, let's look to the value criterion of military effectiveness. Now, let's say you're choking, and I use the Heimlich maneuver to save your life, but you die anywhere. Does that mean that the Heimlich maneuver isn't effective, so we shouldn't use it?
Well, you're misconstruing the link that I drew between military effectiveness and societal welfare. The point is that when effectiveness is present, it more often results in societal welfare.
But
aside from that, what you're doing is taking the idea of effectiveness to the logical extreme. Obviously, if you do that, that's going to result in some sort of absurd situation where we can't see like whether or not effectiveness really plays a role in determining the value. But in the context of this resolution, we need to be reasonable and consider what military effectiveness means in the context of U.S. foreign policy.
Okay, so then how do you define military effectiveness?
Well, it's defined, I think it's sort of, I mean, I guess it's sort of tautological, but it's basically the ability of the government to pursue, the military rather, to pursue the objectives that have been set out by the government.
Okay, in contention when you say that we can't function without private military firms, where have you done like any comparative analysis that shows us specifically private military firms are the things that are needed to help the overstretched military?
Well, that's what my whole first contention is about. I gave you the specific example of Afghanistan, where were we not to employ private military firms, our military presence there would be less than half of what it is today. So very clearly, I think it goes without saying that that sort of thing cannot be conducive to achieving our
Right,
military
but why are
objectives.
private military firms the only people that can fulfill these roles?
Because our military has decreased in size so greatly since the end of the Cold War. And that's what I started out with.
So we don't have any other options of any kind of army or anything that could fulfill these
no
roles?
other viable options is what I would say.
Okay. And why is that they're not viable? Any other option?
I mean, I'm not obligated to come up with options against private military to be used in substitution for private military firms.
Okay,
I just don't think there are any out there.
If I provide any alternative that's actually better than private military firms, then wouldn't that be better for today's resolution?
Well, just because there's some alternative to the use of private military firms doesn't mean that those firms themselves are unjust. So you need to demonstrate both that the firms shouldn't be used and that there are other viable alternatives.
Okay. And in contention, too, you say they're good at what they do. And are you advocating the use of these firms only for, like, logistics?
No, they do tons of different purposes. I gave you the example of Iraq, where 11% were there for security purposes. The other 89% were there for things like intelligence and logistical purposes.
So
but the point is, we need to consider all of the roles that they serve, not just the military
Okay,
ones.
but isn't, like, the whole idea is that they're specifically trained for, like, combat and they're better? So then why would we, like, not use them?
Well, that was an assertion that you just made, that they are better, that they're trained specifically for combat. And as I told you in my case, that's not true. They're trained for other roles as well.
Okay, thank you.
You are listening to the High School Debate Championship from the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Eric Wellman, joined alongside John Mercer. John is a debate coach at Olmsted Falls High School. Hi.
How are you today, Eric?
Doing very well. And the resolution they're debating is the United States is justified in using private military firms abroad to pursue its military objectives. Now, this is a Lincoln-Douglas-style debate.
Correct.
What does that mean?
It means just as Lincoln and Douglas debated one-on-one in 1858, the National Forensic League has adopted a debating format that allows for a one-on-one style debate. There are other forms of debate that our students participate in competitively, including policy debate and public forum debate. Those are tag team. They're partners in both of those styles of debate. This is the one-on-one version.
Now, we're listening to Gurbani Kaur, a sophomore at Hathaway Brown, and Evan Meisler, a senior at University School. How did these students get selected to be here?
Debaters in Ohio are fortunate enough to have two venues to compete. One is the Ohio High School Speech League. The other is the National Forensic League. Yes, we are the NFL.
The NFL.
And the National Forensic League District Championships, which determines who will represent Cleveland and Northeastern Ohio at our national finals. We purposely hold out the final championship round so that it can be held here at the City Club. So these two fine youngsters have really worked hard and earned the right to be here today through many rounds of competition and debate.
At this moment, what are the students preparing?
Well, they've both done a tremendous amount of research, as you can tell from the debate so far. But during the course of the debate, obviously they don't know what the other person is going to be talking about, and they need a little bit of time to prep and to think and to figure out what their next move will be, and I think we're just about ready to get that next move from Gurbani.
Before I begin my speech, I'd like to take a few moments to thank the people who have made it possible for me to be here today. First, my brother Akaljot Singh for his support and guidance, and my coach, Mr. Habig, for his interesting, very informational practices. Then I'd like to thank my friends and teammates, especially Brenna Scully and the HBLD debaters. I would also like to thank Mr. Christ and Ms. Rose for their unwavering support of HB Speech and Debate team and my parents. Finally, last but not least, I would like to thank the City Club of Cleveland and the firm of Baker and Hostetler for sponsoring this event. So if everyone's ready, I'll begin my case. I negate. Since the resolution explicitly charges us to determine whether the United States is justified in using private military firms, and the definition of justified is to prove to be right or just, my value for the round is justice defined as giving each his due. My value criterion is protecting the right to life. Because the right to life is a natural right, all people are due the protection of this right simply because they are human beings. My sole contention is that the use of private military firms increases outbreaks of wars, thus trapping nations into a cycle of conflict, reducing the power of peaceful solutions such as diplomacy. Subpoint A. PMFs allow military force to be used at a lower cost to the country, making the use of force more common. Scott M. Sullivan, assistant professor of law at LSU, wrote, "As the public soldiers must be trained and remain prepared for action at any time, they cannot be discarded as their need for services wanes. They continue to draw a full salary and accrue benefits packages and remain in the force structure much longer, while PMFs can be immediately dismissed, reducing costs and saving the government over $1 billion. The Department of Defense increasingly relies upon contractors to support operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. In both war efforts, 19% more PMFs than U.S. military personnel are being used. Thus, because of the availability of these economically beneficial soldiers, the government is more likely to ignore diplomacy. Rolf Uelessesser, author of Servants of War, explains, "The money used by KBR in Iraq alone could have sufficed to render military interventions in many parts of the world unnecessary. Moreover, several of the wars in the Southern Hemisphere could have been prevented if the world's richest nations, i.e. the U.S., had expanded state institutions for diplomacy instead of investing in a plethora of soldiers from PMS. Thus, war is maximized while simultaneously decreasing peaceful diplomacy, maximizing a loss of life, so PMFs are unjust." Subpoint B. PMFs are not systematically held accountable. They commit atrocities without checks and decrease the U.S. image abroad. Jeffrey S. Turner, an Army lawyer, explains the impacts of recent Blackwater incidents in Nisour Square. The deadly exchange had strategic implications which adversely affected U.S. effort to defeat insurgency in Iraq. The local populace does not distinguish between PMFs and the U.S. military involved. In many Iraqi minds, the perceived failures of Blackwater contractors to safeguard their lives and instead harm them are simply American failures. Several PMFs involved in Abu Ghraib and the Bagram detention facility prisoner torture incidents have yet to be prosecuted. In February of 2011, Stephen Cole wrote in The New Yorker, "The Obama administration has refused to join talks with the Taliban ambassadors to diplomatically end terror. Instead, Defense Secretary Robert Gates argues that Obama's surge of troops, largely due to PMFs, needed more time to inflict moral sapping damage on the Taliban. They thought that these leaders would not take peace talks seriously unless they were sufficiently battered. These refusals for peaceful diplomacy allow the U.S., the terrorist organizations such as the Taliban, to portray the U.S. of having a militaristic culture." The former ambassador of Taliban to Pakistan said that the U.S. is not ready to make positive progress. This refusal for diplomacy has also promoted a nationalistic surge against U.S. soldiers, accounting for a 5-fold increase in Taliban membership since 2006, according to NATO, and an all-time terrorist death toll high in Afghanistan in 2010. Thus, we negate. So let's take a look at Evans' value and value criterion. He gives you the value of societal welfare. And essentially, when we're looking to societal welfare, we're only looking to the United States citizens. But I'm going to argue that societal welfare is specifically looking to protection of the right to life. But what Evans' failing to notice is that the right to life is a natural right, so everyone is due this protection of right, not just American citizens. So for that reason, you'll see his value is really a mere portion of the of looking to the resolution and not the entire scope. Secondly, he gives you the military effectiveness as the value criterion further out. Go back to the Heimlich maneuver example. Just because something is ineffective, that doesn't mean that we don't use it because it may not benefit one person in society at the moment. But instead, we should continue to use them in the most plausible ways. Then secondly, he doesn't give us any bright line of how a military is effective. There can be, like, for example, Hitler's army was quite effective in committing genocides and, like, harming other people, but they weren't necessarily benefiting society as a whole. So there's no link there. Then look to his contention 1. He argues that basically we don't have any other options to accommodate for this overstretched military. But remember that if we have, this is good to have an overstretched military and not use PMFs, because it gives us incentive to use diplomacy, because we're going to actually think before we act. And you can see in the 2011, entering into the Iraq War, we didn't even look to diplomacy in the first place. Secondly, U.S. soldiers the amount of them can be increased if we give them better benefits packages. This has been implemented throughout time. Thirdly, I would argue that we can look to the effect of a draft. On all of these would be more just and promote more protection of the right to life, because they are politically accountable. None of these firms will ever be politically accountable, nor are they legally accountable. In his contention, he gives you, he talks about how 11% were used for security purpose, but then 89% were essentially used for these different tasks. We do not need private military firms to do that. And you can see that since we're using 89% of them to do these other tasks that a majority of citizens can do, even the fighters themselves, we're not really achieving his value of military effectiveness there. Then, he talks about how they're trained for a surveillance technology. Remember, he's not showing, specifically with the 89% not being used for those purposes, we're not maximizing the ability of these private military firms. Now, on contention 2. He says that they're good at what they do and that they are held accountable in a financial sense, but this is simply not true. Look to the fact that with KBR, when they were in Iraq, they created such shoddy showering systems that they are held accountable. They would be deemed accountable, but they're not actually legally accountable for 17 total U.S. lives, because when they went to take their shower, they got electrocuted and died. Then you can also look to Blackwater itself. All they did was change their name, but we continue to keep using these same systems, and we continue to keep contracting them. So even if he's arguing that they have this financial accountability, we really don't, because remember, they're cost effective to us. We have no reason to want to prosecute them. Instead, we use them to go to war, and then we're going to maximize the loss of life and harm societal welfare as well. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready? All right, so you gave the example of private military contractors acting in irresponsible ways at Abu Ghraib, Nisour Square, and KBR creating faulty showers, right?
Yeah, and I also gave you the background detention facilities.
Okay, so when did all of these things happen?
Well, they were actually pretty recent. Like you cited, you're like citing the UCMJ. Then the UCMJ was in place when these were happening.
Okay,
they could have been held accountable, but they weren't.
All right, so the Nisour Square massacre occurred in 2007. Abu Ghraib occurred in 2004. The legislation that I mentioned in my case was passed in 2008.
Right.
So it seems to me like the methods of holding them accountable all occurred after these abuses, right?
Okay, even if you say that, remember there's no incentive for us to actually hold them accountable. Remember that they're extremely economically beneficial, so we continue to use them.
In your own case, didn't you say that their use hurts our image or something like that?
Yes.
So wouldn't that be an incentive to hold them accountable?
But we can see that systematically there have been laws in the past as well to try to hold them accountable. But again, we don't have any
what other laws were in place
like
before?
MEJA, for example.
Okay, that was passed in the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, right?
Right.
Passed in 2008.
Yes, and some of these
so that was
things
also
that I'm citing
that was
have
also
occurred
passed,
after that.
Like what?
Specifically the background detention facility torture.
Okay,
in
when was that?
That was in 2009.
Okay, and do you have evidence for that? Because I'm not entirely sure.
I mean, it's in my case. Like I don't have it specifically cited for you.
Understand. Okay, now let's move on to your own case. Your value is justice, right?
Correct.
Are people given their due if they exist in a society without welfare?
What I'm going to argue is that when you look to justice, it's what people are due. And if you look to the resolution, it says abroad. So we're talking about the international arena. When you look to the international arena, it's in a state of nature. So everyone is due their natural rights. There's no differentiation.
Would you say that the U.S. military ever benefits the people that it works for in other countries?
It might in some instances, but remember that the U.S. military has a foremost obligation to its own citizens.
Okay, it has a foremost obligation to its own citizens.
Right.
Okay. In your response to my case, didn't you say that we should be looking out for everybody's rights?
Yes, and that's why we use diplomacy
but you just said
first.
That we have
Remember, I'm arguing that we
citizens.
use diplomacy first, and only in instances where diplomacy doesn't work, then we would try to use the U.S. military, because they're always going to be more politically accountable than any of these private military firms.
You agree then that there are instances where diplomacy doesn't work?
I mean, you'd have to specifically cite that any of these are actually we could have used that diplomacy would have failed.
Right. So
but
do you think that it's ever possible that war might be inevitable, that somebody might decide to attack us
we have this
considering
increase
diplomacy?
of the plethora of soldiers available to us. We're not even considering diplomacy because it's so economically beneficial to us.
We only employ, what's more cost effective, not going to war or using PMCs?
Okay, remember, again, having this available to us is allowing us to ignore looking to diplomacy because it's perceived to not be extremely advantageous as private military firms economically.
Thank you.
2 minutes, please. We're at the high school debate championship at the City Club of Cleveland, and we're back with John Mercer, who's the debate coach at Olmsted Falls High School. John, give us an idea of the kind of preparation that goes into the debate today.
Some of the debaters that compete for our schools in Ohio actually go to summer camp, and they learn technique and do research for a couple of weeks at a time in order to get ready for the season. And then the course of our season is very long. We actually start during the the fall athletic season. We compete all the way through winter and into the spring season. So whether it's football, track, or basketball, our kids are debating. They're working with coaches, they're researching the topics, and as you've seen here, that both debaters have put together very well-researched cases illustrating their points, and then after they've stated those points, are really prepared to question their opponent. And I think we saw some really great examples on both sides of true understanding of the topic.
I want to remind our listeners that the resolution they're debating is the United States is justified in using private military firms abroad to pursue its military objectives. And Gurbani had alluded to the work that her coach made her go through, some of the drills. What kind of drills are we talking about?
That's going to vary from coach to coach. One thing I've learned in a couple of decades of coaching here in northeastern Ohio is that the men and women who choose to work with our kids are each very individual. And some of those coaches are going to be very directly involved with their students, helping them with the research, helping them in the library, helping them write their cases. Others take a more hands-off approach. And as to the coaching styles of each of these two students' coaches, I haven't been in the room, so I don't know exactly, but I do know both coaches, and they're excellent men who have clearly prepared both of these students very well.
So we have 3 judges who are judging today's debate. Are they looking at both substance and style?
I believe they would be, yes. I'm not going to try to say anything out loud since they can hear us, and I don't want to in any way prejudice them, but yes, both style and substance will come into their critique.
Okay, is everyone ready? All right. Let's start at the top of my opponent's case. My opponent's value is justice. Now, my response to this value is that justice cannot be achieved without societal welfare. If society exists in a state of disorder or disarray, clearly justice is not being achieved. So we need societal welfare in order for people to receive their due. Furthermore, the definition that I provided you of justified points to very clear reasons to use the value of societal welfare rather than justice. Now, my opponent's value criterion is the right to life. My response to this is that without an effective military, the right to life cannot be preserved. We need an effective military to ensure that human rights are protected around the world, that democracy is protected, and that terrorism can be effectively combated. So for all of these reasons, my value criterion is a prerequisite to that of my opponent. Now let's move on to my opponent's first contention. It's that the use of private military contractors cause war. Now, the fact is, private military contractors are only employed during periods of war, unlike a standing army, which means they have to be paid for while war is actually happening. Therefore, it remains a more cost-effective strategy to use diplomacy, even if private military contractors exist. So the fact is, if, like my opponent says, we're driven entirely by economic motives, we will still be more likely to use diplomacy than to use private military contractors. Remember, even if you use contractors, peace is more cost-effective than war. What's critical here is that there are situations where diplomacy doesn't work, where war is inevitable, when we're dealing with irrational actors like terrorist organizations. At that point, when our military will be employed, we need it to be effective for it to get its job done, and private military contractors are essential for that. In fact, in my opponent's subpoint A, she conceded the effectiveness of these military contractors by pointing out the cost-effectiveness arguments. Now, my opponent's subpoint B is that private military firms are not usually held accountable. Now, she gives all of these examples of Abu Ghraib and the Nisour Square massacre and things like this. But let's remember, all of these incidents occurred before the legislation that I mentioned in my case was passed. So that means that the mechanisms in place to hold them accountable today weren't present when my opponent's the human rights abuses my opponent brought up occurred. These mechanisms will work today. Furthermore, the fact is most private military firms don't act in a way that violates human rights, so above all, the benefit that they yield to our military is so great that it would warrant a couple instances of misbehavior here and there. Now let's move on to my own case. My opponent responded to my value of societal welfare, saying that we need to extend the right to life to everybody, and that would be a reason to use justice. First of all, she never responded to any of the reasons I gave in my case to use societal welfare as our value, which is that the government and military are supposed to promote welfare. But furthermore, my opponent conceded in cross-examination that the United States has the foremost military obligation to its own people, which means that societal welfare, or in other words, looking out for the well-being of our own citizens, is still the primary value for this round. My opponent's response to my value criterion of military effectiveness is that military effectiveness doesn't always lead to societal welfare. Now, she gave the example of Hitler. The fact is, the United States military isn't about to go out and cause the Holocaust. Basically, our military is better regulated than this, and we understand that that proper regulation is a component of military effectiveness. So all of these abuses that my opponents are talking about won't really come into play. Now, my opponent's response to my first contention is that there are better alternatives, such as better bonus packages or a draft. Now, the bonus packages simply aren't decisive enough. We need a way to make sure that our army is big enough, not just a hope. And furthermore, my opponent says that we should employ a draft. If anything, that's considerably more unjust. We saw the example of Vietnam, where the draft was viewed by the population as a very negative thing. So that is not an alternative that we ought to look to in this round. My opponent also said that this presents us with an incentive to use diplomacy. The fact is, we still can look to diplomacy prior to private military contractors, but every once in a while diplomacy fails, and then we need a good army. My opponent's response to my second contention is that KBR caused number of U.S. deaths with bad showers and things like Blackwater, but the fact is, all of these can be fixed by modern legislation. Finally, she failed entirely to respond to my second contention, so point B, about professionalism, so we can clearly see that our military will be more effective with the use of private military firms. Thank you.
It's the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Eric Wellman, joined alongside John Mercer, the debate coach at Olmsted Falls High School. What's going on right now? Where are we in this debate?
The rules of Lincoln-Douglas debate are very clear to give neither side an advantage. Where the affirmative speaker speaks first and last, the negative speaker has larger speaking block times so that both sides have as even a playing field as is possible. We've gone through the process of both debaters giving us their constructive speeches, telling us their points of view. Both speakers have cross-examined the others, and now we're in a position where they're analyzing and rebutting the case that's before us.
Each student has 4 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, of thinking time. I'm not sure
preparation
what the term
time.
is. Preparation time. And that's more than it used to be.
The National Forensic League bumped it up by a minute. Isn't it wonderful that we're letting our children think for 1 more minute?
What was the thinking behind that?
Usually it's fairness and effectiveness, but truthfully I wasn't, again, in the room when the National Forensic League Board made that ruling.
Now, does the NFL also choose the topics of the debate?
Yes, they choose a series of topics during the year. As I was mentioning earlier, the policy debaters will debate the same topic all year long, and boy, do they know it by the end of the year. The public forum debaters will change topics every month, so they have to start the process over every 30 days. And in Lincoln-Douglas, it's every 2 months.
I imagine coming up with topics can't be an easy thing because they've got to have, I guess, strong points on both sides.
They do, and I will tell you from behind the scenes that coaches will make their opinions very loudly heard if they believe that the NFL has chosen a bad topic. That does on occasion happen.
And it looks like we are just about to resume right now.
Before I begin, just a brief roadmap. We'll go look at Evan's case, then we'll go to my case, and I'll give you some key voting issues. Everyone ready? So start with the value of societal welfare. remember that he doesn't really respond to the fact that societal welfare is really buying into my value criterion today, in that it's looking specifically to the right to life. But remember that the right to life is a natural right, and everyone is due equal protection of this right, not just American citizens. While it is true that the U.S. military is going to be looking to our citizens foremostly, we can see that in this entire debate that they're also held politically and legally accountable, so they're less likely to promote violations of these rights, whereas private military firms are not. So societal welfare is actually hindered when we do use private military firms. Now, look to the value criterion of military effectiveness. Remember, he never responds to the example I gave you of the Heimlich maneuver. Remember, just because something is ineffective, that doesn't mean it leads to bad society or it leads to injustices. So because he doesn't respond to that, that's breaking the link between military effectiveness and societal welfare. But secondly, remember, we can have effective militaries that don't uphold societal welfare. Specifically, look back to the Hitler example I gave you. Now, he says that the military won't be going out, our U.S. military won't be going out and doing that. Remember, that's going to be specifically flowing to the negative, because the negative would be upholding that we could use the U.S. military better because it's politically and legally more accountable than private military firms, which have no obligation to just look to the United States. Okay. In contention 1, he argues about how we can't function with them. He tries to respond by saying that drafting is unjust. But remember, drafting would be just because justice is implying reciprocating people's dues. And with we have a draft, we do have exceptions for those who would not be able to physically or emotionally manage what it entails to go to war. So I would argue that drafting is still more just than using private military firms who have absolutely no check on them. Then remember that just by virtue of being allowed to use private military firms, we're not even looking to diplomacy as much as we could have been if we just allow us to use only U.S.-based things. So for those reasons, you're going to extend the major arguments I made against him, and you're not going to look to what he's saying. What he's saying that it's not decisive, and that these private military firms are later. He talks about how they're only used in times of peace. We'll address this later. Then he says I don't respond to contention 2, talking about how they're highly professional. Remember, examples and history have shown that they're really not that professional. I don't think it's very professional for someone to go out and perpetrate human rights abuses, harm our own U.S. military by electrocuting them because of their shoddy work. That's not very professional. Okay. In contention 2, he talks about how they're good at what they do. He drops this entire contention in his rebuttal. I specifically talking about how they're not legally nor politically accountable because these laws have been existing, but they're never going to be systematically applied because they are so cost effective, and we look to private military firms before even thinking about diplomacy. Let's take a look at my case. So in looking to the value of justice, he attacks this by saying that it can't be achieved if it were in a disarray. But remember, there is no world government, and we're looking abroad. We're looking to the international arena. That means that his arguments is going to fall because if we're looking to the international arena, that's in a state of nature. So he's saying that there can be no world justice. Okay. Then looking to the value against my value criterion, he says that an effective military is a prerequisite to this, but it's absolutely not. He's ignoring the 2 examples I gave you, the Heimlich maneuver and Nazi Germany with Hitler going and perpetrating human rights abuses. That's not a just thing, but it was quite effective at what he wanted to do. Okay. On to my contention 1. I talked about how they increase the outbreak of war and they trap nations into a cycle of war where they don't use diplomacy. Evan really just responds to the fact by saying that they're only employed during a time of peace. Remember, that's not what my argument is. The argument is that we have these available to us, so we're never even evaluating whether we should use diplomacy or not. I gave you the example of Iraq in 2003 where we didn't evaluate this effectively. We just jumped to the conclusion that we should go and invade, and we used private military firms to do this. So that's going to extend through the round. Then he says that against my subpoint B, he says that these aren't going to occur and that he has these laws, for example. Remember, they're not being systematically applied and there's no political accountability whatsoever of any private military firm. And then he says that finally that this competing market is going to incentivize them to act professionally. But remember, we still employed Blackwater. All they did was change their name, and we're continuing to use them. That's not really holding them accountable for the abuses that they've conducted. Neither were they legal, and they won't even legally accountable either. So key voting issues in today's round. First, you're going to prefer the use of justice, giving each their due, because I'm looking to the full scope of the resolution, whereas Evan is only looking to societal welfare, only looking to America. But we're looking to the international arena as prescribed by abroad. Secondly, we're going to use the value criterion of protection of the right to life, because I'm giving you a clear weighing mechanism in today's debate to determine if we're actually achieving the resolutional burden, whereas Evan doesn't give you a clear weighing mechanism with military effectiveness. He gave you exactly no bright line of determining when a military is effective, and that military effectiveness doesn't even link to societal welfare. The second voting issue will be the fact that using PMFs, having them available, decreases the right to life, because we're not even looking to peaceful solutions. I gave you several examples throughout the round that showed how we're ignoring diplomacy and we're increasing loss of life by virtue of just going to war. Then, the next voting issue will be the fact that when we look to private military firms, they are not systematically political nor legally accountable for their actions. Remember, Blackwater, all they did was change their name, and we continue to use them, and that we're hiring them. It's a competing market. We still chose them. And similarly, I gave you the other examples like that we used in Iraq. Thank you.
Got a brief break in the action now at the High School Debate Championship. It's an annual event at the City Club of Cleveland. I'll remind our audience that this is the resolution they're debating. The United States is justified in using private military firms abroad to pursue its military objectives. The students are Gurbani Kaur, a sophomore at Hathaway Brown. She's arguing the negative side. On the affirmative is Evan Meisler, a senior at University School. I've got to ask John Mercer before I run out of time, how do the students learn to speak so quickly?
This is not as quickly as they can speak.
I know, I've heard faster, but it's a rapid way of talking.
It's practice, and they practice a great deal, and because there are such close time constraints on each of their sections of debate, the constructive, the cross-ex, they want to make sure they get all of their points in, and the way to do that is to speak quickly.
Talk to me a bit about the high school debate scene here in Ohio. I understand the state's broken up into districts.
It is. There are 6 districts in the state of Ohio, in the Ohio High School Speech League, and 4 national districts for the National Forensic League.
And is it common to have sort of a championship event like this?
No, it's not. In fact, debate coaches around the state are pretty jealous of us because the City Club provides this kind of exposure, and really it's a great venue for our students. And I would venture to say that few places in the country give this kind of positive exposure to student speech and debate as the City Club and Baker Hostetler.
You and I have been doing commentary at this annual event for most of the past 5 years. And I noticed that most of the time, if not exclusively, it's private schools that are competing in this championship.
Well, as a public school coach, I have to agree with you, and that burns a little. But the reality is, in Cleveland, several of our private schools are extraordinarily strong, especially in debate. But give the public schools their due. The state PF champions this year were from a public school.
It looks like Evan Meisler is about to take the podium.
Okay, is everyone ready? All right. Let's start off with the value debate. Now, in my last rebuttal, I responded to my opponent's value of justice by basically saying that without societal welfare, people aren't receiving their due. My opponent tried to dodge this response by basically saying that we should be concerned with the international arena, not just our own citizens. But let's remember, my opponent conceded in cross-examination that our military and our government have the primary objective to look to our own citizens first. So above all, we need to look to our own citizens, not to the international arena when we're considering U.S. governmental policy. At that point, we need to look to societal welfare as a prerequisite to justice and as the primary focus in this round. For that reason, it should be the value. Now let's move on to the value criterion debate. I respond to my opponent's value criterion of the right to life by saying that an effective military is necessary to protect the right to life. Now she continues to hold on to her Hitler and Heimlich example. Now again, our military is better regulated by our notions of morality than Hitler's army ever could have been. So we're not going to see the same sort of abuses coming out of an effective U.S. military that we saw coming out of an effective Nazi German military. But moreover, the Heimlich example really is sort of a converse error. What my opponent said about the Heimlich maneuver is that because even if it is ineffective sometimes, we would still use it. But the fact is, the reason why we use it at all, why it's ever been developed, is because potentially it has the ability to save someone's life. And that's the same sort of reasoning that we're looking for the military. We want a military that's effective so that it has the potential to do good for society. Now let's remember, my opponent didn't offer any responses throughout the entire course of this round to my observation that we need to be looking at this debate in terms of a general principle, or to my second contention, subpoint B, about professionalism and how they're mostly drawn from ex-military agents. Now, this is especially important in the round because that means that isolated incidents of human rights abuses don't matter. Now, my opponent brought up a couple incidents of human rights abuses, but first of all, those were all introduced after new legislation meant to hold private firms accountable, and additionally, she doesn't account for the fact that the vast majority of the time these private firms still do act accountably, which, according to my first observation, is a reason to affirm. Let's also remember she didn't defend herself against my response to her first contention, that since it's still more cost-effective to remain at peace, we won't discard diplomacy just because we have private military firms. She dropped that point entirely. So with that said, let's move on to the key voting issues. The first is the accountability argument. My opponents provided you with no real modern examples of how private military firms have acted unaccountably since the passage of new legislation. And even if she did, as I told you in my first observation, which she dropped, isolated incidents of human rights abuses don't matter in this round. We need to consider what's good for the United States as a whole. My second key voting issue is the diplomacy debate. Since it's still more cost-effective to remain at peace, we will choose to use diplomacy before private military firms, but when diplomacy is impossible, we need a strong army. And the final key voting issue is the necessity debate, because the size of our military is simply too small, regardless of a draft which is unjust or more incentives to join the army. We need private military firms to serve key roles that are necessary to our military's functionality. For all of these reasons, I urge you to affirm. Thank you. Good round.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to the annual High School Debate Championship sponsored by the law firm Baker & Hostetler. We'll return to the program in just a moment, but a few announcements first as the votes are being tabulated. We welcome all of you here today and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Radio broadcasts of the City Club are made possible through the generous support of Case Western Reserve University. Our television broadcast partners are WVIZ PBS IdeaStream and Time Warner Cable. Television broadcasts are supported by PNC and Cleveland State University. We have live audio webcasts available through WCLV and Cleveland.com, and our live televised webcasts are supported by the University of Akron. Each year, the City Club High School Debate Championship is sponsored by the law firm of Baker & Hostetler in memory of Pat Jordan. This is a wonderful and lasting tribute to Pat and also enables the City Club to invite high school debaters from throughout the region to attend, as well as classmates and families of the contestants. John Parker, we would like to recognize and thank Baker & Hostetler for its ongoing support of this important program. Thank you very much. We are very pleased to welcome students here today as part of the City Club student program. We have students from about 15 area high schools here today. Their participation is made possible by a generous grant from the Fred E. Scholl Foundation, Bernard L. Carr, Chairman. I'd now like to call John Parker back to the podium to announce the results and to present the trophies.
Thank you, Paul. And congratulations to Gurbani and Evan on both on an outstanding debate. We were really treated to what I think was a much better performance than I'm sure we'll see over at Quicken Loans Arena from the Buckeyes later today. But in what was a very, very close debate, I would like to congratulate this year's champion of the 2011 High School Debate Championship from University School, Evan Meisler. Gurbani, congratulations. Thank you.
Well, that does it for today. We've been listening to the annual High School Debate Championship, sponsored, as we've said, by the law firm Baker and Hostetler. Thank you and congratulations to both of our contestants. You did a fine job. Thank you, debaters. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.